Hi, this is Gabe from FluentForever.com. At this point, you've seen and heard all of the vowels and consonants of Korean. If you're using one of my trainers, it will take you through each of the sounds you've encountered here, teach you the spellings that produce those sounds, and push them into your long-term memory. And if you're not, that's okay too. The goal of these videos was to give you a passing familiarity with all the available sounds, so that when you study them in detail, they're not going to be totally new to you. That'll make them easier to learn. In either case, since you're now familiar with all the sounds of Korean and their IPA symbols, I want to spend some time discussing Korean spelling rules. Basically, how to go from what you read to what you say out loud. Spelling rules show up in basically every language. In English, for instance, when we pluralize words, we add an S to them. We take a word like ant and add an S. You get ants. But if you take a word like bug and you pluralize it, suddenly there's a problem. It's really hard to put a voiced g sound with an unvoiced s sound and say bugs. And so we say bugs, turning that S into a Z. And we don't even think about it. We apply that rule automatically. But that's not the only way to solve the G plus S problem. In a language like German, they'd solve this problem by turning the G into a K and saying bucks. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that basically every language solves these kinds of hard-to-pronounce sound combinations in a different way. And the challenge with Korean is that many of its particular solutions are going to be really unfamiliar to you, especially at first. And to add to that, I think objectively, they're kind of complicated. My goal with this video is to give you a big picture overview of how Korean sound rules work, so you can start to understand the logic behind them. That way, whether you're studying on your own or using my pronunciation trainer, you can start to see those rules getting applied, understand what's happening, and eventually start to apply them yourself automatically. So let's get started. As a sort of unifying story to this video, we're going to talk about Meg Ryan. Specifically, how on earth the Korean pronunciation of her name goes from Meg Ryan
all the way to Meg Ryan.
Because if you can really understand that process, then you've already understood most of Korean spelling rules. So, let's start with her first name, Meg. The first thing we need to do is swap this over to Korean sounds and letters.
The closest versions of the English sounds are e, forming the syllable block that looks like this, Meg.
If you were to pronounce this syllable, you wouldn't get Meg, you'd get Meg, ending in an unreleased K. And that takes us to our very first rule, the rule of unreleased consonants. If any one of Korean's unvoiced consonants comes at the end of a word or before another consonant, it's going to turn into one of three sounds: unreleased K, unreleased P, or unreleased T.
So if you combine b, a, ak, you get ba. And interestingly enough, if you combine b, a, and g together, where the last letter is a tense K sound, you still get the exact same pronunciation, ba.
Even though there are three different K sounds in Korean, you're only going to encounter those sounds at the beginning of a syllable. When you're looking at one of those three Ks at the end of a word, or at the end of a syllable before another consonant, they're all going to simplify down to one simple unreleased K. And that doesn't just apply to K, not by a long shot. The three Ps all turn into unreleased P.
As in ip and ip.
And here's the big one. All the other unvoiced consonants, every one of them, turn into unreleased T. Not just the three T's, but also the three ch sounds, the two S's, and the H sound as well. Basically, if it's at the end of a word or before another consonant, and it's not some sort of K or P sound, it's going to be an unreleased T. So that's rule one. The next rule we'll talk about is the rule of voicing. Basically, if you see one of the unvoiced consonants, either between two vowels or between a voiced or l sound and a vowel, then that unvoiced consonant is going to become voiced.
This is where the B, D, G, and J sounds from video 2 show up in Korean. So here's jang, meaning sauce, starting with an unvoiced ch sound. And here's 간장, soy sauce, where that N at the end of the first syllable turns our unvoiced ch sound into j. 장, 간장.
And with that covered, we're ready for rule 3, consonant relinking. This rule kicks in when you have a syllable that ends in a consonant, and then the next syllable begins with a vowel. This is going to happen really frequently. Basically, anytime you see a three-letter syllable followed by a syllable starting with Korean's placeholder letter, that circle. In cases like that, the final consonant in the first syllable will jump up into the next syllable, replacing that placeholder letter. So umak isn't pronounced ak. It's pronounced umak. The first syllable is and the second one, ma, umak. This rule will sometimes let you hear consonants that would otherwise be silent. Sometimes you'll run into Korean syllables that are spelled with two consonants at the end, like the first syllable in Korean's word for width, 넓이. That first syllable alone is pronounced 널, even though there's a b at the end of it. It's only because that next syllable starts with a vowel that rule 3 kicks in, the b gets knocked into the beginning of the second syllable, and you can actually hear the sound. 넓이. Rule 3 can interact with the first and second rules in an interesting and slightly complex and hard to follow way.
For instance, take the phrase clothing is 옷은. It's basically a two-syllable word comprised of the letters O, S, U, N.
If these two syllables were two totally separate words, then rule 1 would kick in for the first syllable. In that scenario, you're looking at an unvoiced sound, in this case, an unvoiced sound that's not a K or a P, at the end of a word.
And so you would pronounce that word as 옷 with an unreleased T.
But we're not actually at the end of a word, not technically, and so that doesn't happen. Also, since the next syllable starts with a vowel, rule 3 will kick in and bounce that S sound to the beginning of the next syllable.
Instead of an unreleased T, you actually get to hear the final S, giving you 옷은.
Rules 1, 2, and 3 can all operate at the exact same time. Here's how you say it's not a flower in Korean.
꽃 아니요.
Basically, flower
꽃
is not.
아니요. The first word ends in the letter ch.
And rule 1, the rule of unreleased consonants, tells us to pronounce that final consonant, since it's coming at the end of a word,
as an unreleased D sound. So instead of 꽃, we say 꽃.
Now rule 3, consonant relinking, comes in. The next syllable, a, starts with a vowel. And rule 3 tells us that whenever a syllable starts with a vowel, it will steal a consonant from the end of the previous syllable. So that t sound gets bumped to the beginning of the next word.
아니요.
Giving you what sounds like
다니요.
But we're not quite done yet. Now we're looking at a t sound in between two vowels, and rule 2, the rule of voicing, says that whenever that happens, we have to voice that consonant stuck in the middle. In this case, an unvoiced t sound turns into a d sound. Instead of
꽃 다니요.
we get
꽃 아니요.
This, incidentally, is a taste of why Korean spelling rules can be so challenging. The rules layer on top of each other, which is honestly not something I've seen that often. This is something you need to master both individually and in word combinations. Now, this is totally doable, but it definitely takes some time. As mentioned earlier, our goal here is not to master all the rules, but rather to get a rough sense of the logic behind them and how they work together, so that when you study those rules in detail, either with my trainer or on your own, they don't just seem completely random. We have a couple more rules to go through before we can get all the way over to Meg Ryan. The first of those rules deals with the nasal consonants N and M, and is known as the rule of nasalization. This rule shows up whenever an N or an M occurs immediately after any of the voiceless consonants. In this situation, the voiceless consonant will transform into an N, an M, or that back NG sound, You figure out which one it turns into based upon where that consonant is made in your mouth. Any of the P consonants, for instance, are made with your lips, just like M's are, and so they turn into M's.
That gives you words like 안문. The first syllable is spelled up, but because it shows up right before an M, it turns into 안문.
The K-like consonants are made with the back of your tongue, and so they produce a back NG sound,
That gives you words like 악마, where the first syllable is spelled 악, but since it shows up before an M, turns into 악마.
Last but not least, the T-like consonants turn into N's. And remember, because of rule 1, every other voiceless consonant falls into this category, since they're showing up at the end of a syllable before another consonant. In this case, that other consonant is an N or an M.
That gives you words like 뒷문, where the first syllable is spelled 뒷, but since it shows up before an M, it turns into 뒷문. Our last Meg Ryan related rule relates to Korean's letter for R or L, called 리을.
And just for the purposes of discussing this rule, let's just call this letter Korean's L. We talked about this letter a bit already in video 2, how at the beginning of a syllable it sounds like a tapped R,
as in radio,
and at the end of a syllable it'll sound like an L,
as in 일.
Korean's L acts a bit more strangely when it collides with other consonants, in particular when it comes after another consonant. When that happens, Korean's L transforms into an N. So here's 막루, where the second syllable is spelled du, but is pronounced nu, mangnu. And here's umnyok, where the second syllable is spelled diok, but is pronounced nyok, umnyok. And just to make things a little more tricky, this rule flips around whenever you see an N or an L touching. Anytime that happens, you'll pronounce those two consonants as two L's.
So this word, the word for dentures, isn't pronounced 틀니, but rather 틀리. And this word heater isn't pronounced 날로, but rather 날로.
And now that we've learned Rule 5, we actually have what we need to figure out what's going on with Meg Ryan's name. So first we'll transform her name into its Korean spelling. To do that, we'll need to grab the closest Korean letters to her name, which gives us these.
M-E-G-R-A-I-O-N.
And if we block those letters into syllables and add a few placeholder characters, we get these 4 syllables. Meg, da, I, un. As we start to put these syllables together, our rules will start to trigger. The first one that gets triggered is Rule 1 at the end of the first syllable.
We get meg instead of something like meg.
Next, Rule 5 kicks in. We have a Korean L preceded by another consonant, so that L is going to turn into an N. Our 4 syllables are now meg, na, I, un. Da has turned into na. Our next rule, Rule 4. We just stuck in a new N, and it's coming right before another voiceless consonant. And whenever that happens, we have to replace the voiceless consonant with the nasal consonant, pronounced in the same spot in your mouth. K-like consonants turn into back NG sounds.
So our first syllable goes from meg to meng. And that is how and why Meg Ryan is pronounced Meng-nayan.
Are we through with all of Korean's rules? Well, not entirely, but we've certainly covered the biggest and hardest ones by far. We'll group the remaining rules into 2 categories. First, ways that lax consonants can become tense or aspirated, and then ways to be kind of sloppy with diphthongs. So, first one. Back in video 1, we introduced 12 consonants, 3 T's, 3 K's, 3 P's, and 3 Ch sounds, all of which came in lax, aspirated, and tense varieties.
For T, for instance, we have D, T, and D.
There are a couple of circumstances where a word will be written with a lax letter, but when you pronounce it, that lax sound will transform into a tense or aspirated sound. The first happens when a lax consonant shows up after another voiceless sound.
Like in the word 눕다,
In a case like this, the first syllable will end with an unreleased P sound,
as in nu,
and the second syllable, even though it's written with a lax T sound,
다,
is pronounced tense.
as in 따. So you get 눕다 instead of 눕다.
Then there are the situations where lax consonants can turn into aspirated ones. And this one's actually pretty simple. If you ever see an H consonant next to another consonant, either in front of it or behind it, anywhere, then that H will generally vanish, and the other consonant will become aspirated. So here's natta, which is spelled natta, but pronounced natta, with an aspirated ta at the end. And here's sikye, which is spelled sikye, but pronounced sikye, with an aspirated kye at the end. And our last rule in Korean concerns diphthongs. And this is basically all about being extra sloppy with your pronunciation. This shows up in 2 ways.
The first one shows up in words like 수업.
When you pronounce words like these carefully and slowly,
Then you'd say 수업
but if you're speaking quickly, you'll slide those 2 syllables together.
into 수업.
This can generally happen when the first syllable ends in u, o, or i, and the next syllable starts with a vowel.
So 수업 can turn into 수업, and 미아 can turn into 미아.
Our second diphthong-related rule is what happens when you're speaking quickly with words that have diphthongs already inside them.
Like 유치원. If you pronounce words like this carefully, you'd say 유치원. The last syllable is one. But if you go faster, sometimes you just say 유치원, where in the last syllable, you barely pronounce the W at all, saying on instead of one.
And that is it for Korean spelling rules. This has been the most complex set of rules I've encountered so far. So let's review them, and let's do that in big chunks. So first, rule 1. If any of Korean's unvoiced consonants comes at the end of a word or before another consonant, it's going to turn into one of 3 sounds: unreleased K, unreleased P, or unreleased T. You'll get an unreleased K sound if a word ends in one of the 3 Ks.
Giving you words like 박,
You'll get a P if the word ends in one of the 3 Ps.
giving you words like ip,
And you'll get an unreleased T if it's any other voiceless consonant at all.
giving you words like 꽃.
Rule 2 told us to turn unvoiced consonants into voiced ones when they showed up in between two vowels or between a voiced n, or l sound and a vowel.
That gave us 간장, soy sauce, where that N at the end of the first syllable turned our unvoiced ch into j, 장, 간장.
And Rule 3 told us that whenever a syllable starts with a vowel, it will steal a consonant from the end of the last syllable.
So if you see and ak together, you get 음악.
We then stuck all those rules together,
To figure out 꽃 아니요, flower turned into 꽃.
ending in an unreleased T due to Rule 1. Then Rule 3, consonant relinking, told us to stick that T at the beginning of the next syllable.
Giving us 다니요.
And then since that T was now in between two vowels, Rule 2 voiced it.
Giving us 꽃 아니요.
After that, we covered Rule 4, nasalization, where any voiceless consonants followed by an N or an M turned into nasal consonants, based upon where those consonants were made in your mouth. P's turned into M's, K's turned into back NG, sounds, and everything else turned into N's.
That gave us words like 안문, 악마, and 뒷문, which have the first syllables ap, ak, and j, respectively, but are all pronounced nasal, 안문, 악마, and 뒷문.
And then we covered the relatively odd behavior of Korean's L, which turns into an N when it shows up after other consonants, and once it does, will trigger Rule 4, nasalizing them.
That's what lets us finally decode why Meg Ryan is pronounced Megnayan. Korean's L at the beginning of her last name, Ryan, turned into N, Nayeon.
And that, in turn, caused the K sound at the end of her first name to nasalize, Meng. And then we talked about a couple of ways Korean's lax consonants can turn into tense or aspirated sounds. They go tense when a lax consonant comes after another voiceless consonant.
As in 눕다, which is spelled 눕다, but pronounced 눕다.
And they become aspirated basically whenever a voiceless consonant shows up next to an H.
As in natta, which is spelled nata, but pronounced natta with an aspirated ta at the end.
Finally, we talked about a couple of ways the Korean's vowels will simplify in fast speech.
Words like suop have two vowels when pronounced slowly and carefully, but can turn into diphthongs when pronounced quickly, suop.
And diphthongs can simplify even further, getting skipped altogether.
That happens in words like 유치원, which ends in one when pronounced slowly, 유치원, but can end in un when pronounced quickly, 유치원.
And that wraps up our series on Korean pronunciation. If you need a hand in memorizing all this stuff and training your ears to hear it all accurately, then grab a Korean pronunciation trainer from my website linked below. You'll have all of this memorized within 3 or 4 weeks. I hope you had fun, and I will see you next time.